In fact, do conservatives take on big tech? And joining us on our Newsmaker line to talk about that is Josh Hammer. He is opinion editor at Newsweek, has also been writing about this. Josh, how are you, and welcome to the show.
Rod, it's great to be back with you. Thanks for having me again.
Okay, what about this battle with big tech? Where are we right now in this fight, Josh?
So, look, I think, Rod, you kind of posed the question as, is it time for conservatives to take on big tech? I guess my response to that is, it's been time. It has been time for a long while now. It really should never have gotten to this point. It never should have gotten to the point where Google, Amazon, and Apple could openly collude to take out of existence Parler, the app, obviously, that was supposed to compete with Twitter. For years, Rod, we heard both progressives and kind of more, I guess, free market fundamentalist leaning kind of libertarian conservatives who all told us that the solution was to, quote, build your own Google, right? It's the notion that you kind of start a competitor in your garage and it could take on these corporate robber barons. That's what they've become. They really have become kind of the equivalent of the late 19th century railroad robber barons. And, Parler tried to do that, and they were just kind of kneecapped and taken out of existence. So we are kind of, at this point, I would say on the right, fighting for our right to be heard in the public square. We are fighting for our political relevance, and we're fighting for that political relevance against quasi-private actors that, at least from my perspective, Rod, are not meaningfully private. They kind of act like appendages of the government, especially a democratic government. And, increasingly what we see, tech is kind of the beachhead. It's kind of ground zero of this fight. But we see this kind of with the woke capital phenomenon in general. We increasingly see these purported, quote-unquote, private companies act more like kind of Chinese state capitalism. It kind of reminds me in a sense of, when Deng Xiaoping took over from Mao in the late 70s, in 1980s in communist China, he called it capitalism with Chinese characteristics, was the terminology they use. That's kind of what we're seeing here. So conservatives need to figure out a game plan. They need to figure one out fast.
Josh, all during the life of the Internet, and it's really not that old if you look at it in relative terms, I've always thought the Internet to be kind of like the Wild West. Almost anything goes on it. No one's going to try and attempt to control it, but there really is control in it with these big tech firms. Isn't there any more, Josh?
So, back in the early days of the Internet, in the 1990s, Section 230, which is kind of brought up in the public discourse so often, it was part of the Communications Decency Act of 1996. And this is kind of the early stages of the Internet when legislators, lawmakers from across the political aisle, from the Republicans on the right to Democrats on the left, everyone wanted, they were all unified upon kind of giving as much incentives as were possible to get these tech companies to basically innovate, because it was the early days of the Internet. At that time, there was slow dial-up modem. Not many people had their email accounts yet. We kind of wanted to get the ship sailing. And Section 230, which was part of this 1996 legislation, was a provision that basically allowed the tech companies free rein, more or less, to moderate what went up on their site. And in exchange for that, they received immunity, that they would not be sued under traditional libel law, the likes of which publishers, including, us at Newsweek, have to deal with. But, big tech is they've not upheld their end of the bargain.
Yeah.
If you look what Congress said in Section 230, they expressly predicated this grant of immunity upon the tech companies agreeing to host a, quote, diversity of political viewpoints, which is something that they're increasingly not doing. So we do want to encourage innovation, especially conservatives. We obviously agree with innovation, ingenuity, entrepreneurship. These are kind of great virtues of our society. But the bigger issue, I think, facing conservatives, especially in the year 2021, is what to do when private companies cease to act like private companies, and especially when they kind of get a monopolistic acquiring of what is now the proverbial town square, right? We're kind of dealing with the 21st century equivalent of the old public town square.
Josh, how much money would it take? Is it even possible to come up with an alternative to these big tech companies from a conservative point of view? I mean, could it be done? I would imagine it would take a massive amount of money to do.
So it definitely would, right? And, to be sure, despite what happened to Parler, I do think that we should be encouraging as much money as possible, whether it's, financiers, philanthropists, conservatives who effectively have money to deploy. we definitely should be encouraging them to do that. But your options are limited. Again, when Google, Apple, and Amazon can just openly collude to essentially nuke you out of existence like they did to Parler. So we definitely should be encouraging, new tech development in the garage, especially kind of in red states where the regulatory climate and whatnot is probably a little more hospitable to that. But we need to be kind of combining those efforts with, I would say, both statewide, similar to what Ron DeSantis is doing in Florida, and kind of nationally sweeping legislation. So one thing that I personally have kind of come around to supporting, a very prolific essayist who I'm a huge fan of, a guy named Michael Lind, had a wonderful essay at Tablet magazine a few weeks ago. And he basically said that the legal tools that are needed for big tech already exist. We just need to kind of be innovative in how we apply them. And he was talking about, quote unquote, common carrier regulation, which is, usually referred to as airplanes and railroads, and also public accommodation laws, which is kind of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So it would kind of take an innovative statesman or two or three to draft the bill that would apply these already existing legal principles to the situation we face. But I don't think we actually have to look very far. I think most of the tools in our arsenal are actually already there to get us to where we need to be.
What about the idea of some more control being put on this? Do you see that happening at all, Josh? Some regulations?
Yeah, so I definitely do see that happening, right? Regulating big tech is kind of the one issue that folks on the left and the right increasingly agree upon. Of course, they agree on it for very different reasons. Those on the left, of course, were very critical of Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook. They believe that, quote unquote, Russian propaganda somehow stole the 2016 election for President Trump and all that nonsense, frankly. But there's definitely going to be a tipping point of no return for big tech. I think we're rapidly approaching that point. If I could just put in a quick plug, Rod, I volunteer on the side for a group called the Internet Accountability Project. You can find that at theiap.org. We're one of the few groups out there that is kind of pushing this day in and day out. We are fighting this fight. We are trying to get as many lawmakers as possible to kind of rein in Google, Facebook, Twitter, Amazon, a lot of these companies that have frankly just grown way too big for their size. So I do think a day of reckoning is coming sooner rather than later.
How many lawmakers do you think, Josh, have the guts to say, that big campaign contribution you made to me from a big tech company, I'm not going to take it anymore? Are there any politicians with the guts enough out there to say no thanks?
It's a great question. Few and far between. A number of years ago, after my first year of law school summer, I actually was a Senate Judiciary Committee intern for your senator there in Utah, Mike Lee. And Mike Lee is kind of the rare politician who's possibly principled enough to do such a thing, but they are very, very, very few and far between.
All right. Well, Josh, always great chatting with you. Thank you for your time, Josh. We'll have you back on down the road. Thank you.
Thank you.